So getting that community aspect of it, where people are able to support each other, understanding all of the logistics on the same level, understanding the goals in the same way, being able to answer each other's questions. And in fact, as a consultant, one of my favorite things is to work myself out of a job, right? I want that community to be really strong so that I can go away at some point. The organization is still going to be very successful because they're supporting each other.
All right, let's get going. Today is April 5th, 2023, and today we're going to talk about building that plane while you're flying it. So we're going to empower users while you implement Microsoft 365, and hopefully we're going to do a good job at it. The gang is all here. You know us probably pretty well at this point, so let's just jump into our agenda. So we're going to take an iterative approach to using our maturity model, and then we'll talk about some of the administrative steps around doing this kind of work, empowering content owners as you build, and a little nugget on extending Microsoft 365 in a sort of an ALM-y way. All right, so let's start right in, Em, and talk about the maturity model. You're up for that this week, so that'll be fun.
I am, yes. Many of you who join us frequently, you hear us talk about the maturity model a lot. For those of you who are less familiar, I'm going to hit it really quickly. But essentially, a lot of people who are using Microsoft 365 aren't fully sure necessarily of all the capabilities, or they're using it as fully or effectively as they want. So the maturity model for Microsoft 365 is a great socialization tool that has a holistic view of the technology, focusing on business outcomes, so you can gain an understanding of your current state versus your desired state. So looking at the next slide, we can see there's quite a few different levels across the maturity model. So depending on your impact that you want to have at your organization, you might pick a different level. So in these articles, they're broken up between level 100 to 500, and then the impact will talk about what you're going to get at each of those levels. Now, you've heard us say this a couple of different times, that not everybody necessarily needs to be at the same level. It really depends what you're focusing on in your organization. So we're going to use the example of building in intranet for an iterative approach using the maturity model. So going over to our next slide, thinking about these different levels, I have some example impacts that we'll have. Now, an intranet is going to cross a bunch of the different competencies. There are quite a few different competencies across the maturity model for Microsoft 365. So depending on your company goals, you might focus on different ones. If you're trying to improve communication and collaboration, for example, those would be the business competencies you'll focus on. Now here we're looking at those examples going up the levels. So we're focusing on those two competencies for this intranet. And usually at the 100 level, we don't really have any consistency. So maybe there isn't even an intranet. Everyone's just sending emails and that's fine. Then when we head towards 200, maybe people start to move content into some different team sites. 300 is where we see things really be managed at an established organization. And this is usually where we see most intranets really sitting and starting to thrive, when we start to develop that thoughtful site topology, dividing out the communication versus the collaboration content. Then moving up from 300, this is where we see organizations who need to expand in their maturity, and they may have more complexity in their organization, like different roles in different regions. So they might think about things like content targeting for those different roles and regions, or automation specific to my roles and top tasks. And then at the 500 level, very ambitious. Oh, no worries. We are sometimes looking at things like custom solutions. So that's what Julie will talk about a little bit more later when we talk about extending.
I can't believe I moved forward on custom solutions. What was I
thinking? It was
yours. Jesus. I got click happy.
So what you launch depends on what you need. So we're going to use Simpraxis as an example, because we have grown over the past couple of years, and you're going to actually get to see our intranet. So as you can see here, sometimes you might launch with quite literally just a wing that's helping you fly. So as you can see here, we had our very simple user needs statement for our first intranet. We call ourselves Simpraxians. We needed to access our sales pipeline so we could follow up with clients and make sure we were organized and giving the best customer service possible. So all we really had was this link entry point to the things that we're using and a highlight of our recent sites. Now, over the years, our team has grown and matured, and so has our intranet as well. So if we take a look at our version 2, you can see we're moving a little bit closer to something probably like the 300 level, where we now have a lot more information, really bridging together our external systems, bringing them into our intranet. We're sharing our company news here in the top section instead of doing that all through email. And then we still have all of those links to our top tasks that we had before, with a lot more information sent showing what's available across those different working areas. So whenever you're building that plane while flying it, just remember you can continue to add on different pieces and different parts to your plane, even if you just start out with that first wing. And the maturity model can help guide you through that.
While we're flying, Emily keeps throwing us airplane parts from the ground.
Didn't I just change a view in a meeting today? Live.
You did.
Yes.
And in action. I decided that view wasn't working for us and we needed to change it. So we changed it. All right, so let's move forward and talk about what you launch depends on what you need.
So essentially we got to this biplane, and what else can we add to it?
Right. So this is switching gears a little bit. This feels like sort of an abrupt turn to the right, but that's okay. As we're starting these projects, we tend to find that we use the same tooling over and over and over again. So there's some things that we just sort of always want to have available to us as we're sort of kicking things off, because we know we're going to need them at some point. These are not all you have to have them. They're things that you might consider using or getting ready to use right up front. So we find that we use PNP Modern Search, those web parts, almost every single project. I mean, I actually can't think of a project where I haven't used them in some way to cover some sort of user story. And they're very powerful web parts that really ought to be part of your part of your toolkit. You need a SharePoint admin to deploy that solution package, but after that, it's available either to every site if you set it up that way, or to specific sites once you enable it, which is usually what we do. Next thing is PNP PowerShell, which is really the grown-ups version of the SPO PowerShell, which Microsoft manages. PNP PowerShell is the more community-driven, though of course Microsoft is invested in it a lot, and it's blessed, however you do that, by Microsoft. So those PowerShell command let us accomplish a lot of things that you could do through the UI, but you might need to do them repeatedly. Todd's sitting there like, why am I not talking about PowerShell? So it's either something that you need to do a lot of, therefore you want to automate it, or it's something that you can't do through the UI, like instantiate a theme. As far as I know, there's no way in the UI to instantiate that yet. So we just run one little command and it's all done. You need a global admin to consent to be allowed to use that. But after that, it's based on user permissions and skills. The next two are third-party products. This might feel a little bit like an advertisement, but it's not so much. It's that we find that we use ShareGate every single day in a lot of the work that we do. So originally, ShareGate was just a migration tool. We certainly use it for that. We use it to move things from one place to another, whether we're doing a migration or we're just reorganizing content within an existing site. So that's really the care and feeding piece. And then there are a lot of reporting capabilities that are very valuable there for you to think about, sort of understanding your content corpus. What is our content inventory that we're working with, et cetera. There's no install required. That's a desktop product, but you need global admin consent if you want to do certain things. You don't have to have that. Orchestry is a really cool product that is, again, an add-on, and what it lets you do is set up templates for sites. That's the main thing that I think of it for. It does a bunch of other things as well. It's got some reporting capabilities, some metadata management capabilities, but really for me the strongest user story is we're going to have a lot of sites that are or teams that need to look like a particular thing. Like we know that this isn't like a department site where each one's going to be a little bit different. We're going to have projects that we're pounding out every 5 a day, and we want to make sure that they all follow consistent templates. And you can have many templates to meet different needs. And so Orchestry is a great tool for being sure that you have consistently structured sites and teams. Global admin consent to that. Yep.
I have a couple of comments on that one too, because and I had to recently do it, like actually think through if I'm going to automate and I'm going to create the site from code, if I'm going to write a custom whatever it is to automate creating sites from code, I realized that depending on the number of users, so for small and medium organizations where you'd think, oh, I don't know if we want to pay a licensing fee for a tool like this, I couldn't even cover yearly maintenance on the software that I would write for the amount of the licensing fee for the tool for 1 year. And so that coupled with the change the template while flying piece of things, like I just love the fact that I can empower the users that I'm working with to say, okay, we're going to make a project X template site, and that site will be the template for how all other projects look. And so they can just, if they decide they want like a new list or a new library or a switch to some views or whatever it is, they can go to that template site, which we can make personal to, secured to just a couple of people, change the site, and then any new sites created from that get that new look without them having to call back a professional to like rewrite some code. So depending on the size of your organization, that, because that is like a grid that crosses like that, having a tool like Orchestry can really next level a smaller or a medium-sized organization in a way that isn't possible with a custom solution.
Yeah, I mean, I think it puts you at a higher level of maturity. And
really,
we have a lot of clients who say, oh, we have to have templates for things, and you say, okay, well, great, what should be in the template?
Well, I was just
quiet like that.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. So we were talking about automating in the chat room, and Orchestry's the same way. Just having those tools there and thinking about that forces you to look at your process, forces you to give some consideration. Whereas not having those tools there and not having somebody like Mark or I poking you about it, you just kind of throw stuff in, and this group asked for that, and you just add it, and this group asked for that, and you add it. But once you start thinking about automating things and templatizing things, then you kind of get that bump in maturity, whether you meant to or not. And so I think that's a great thing.
Yep. Sorry, Mark, I cut you off for learning solutions.
Totally fine. And why don't you talk about learning solutions?
Oh, do I have to?
No, you don't have to. So if you'd like me
I only know about
continue.
Learning pathways. Viva Learning is an Emily expertise or an EU expertise.
So this row is all about how do we deliver the knowledge, the training, the materials that people need in order to be successful, getting on and off the plane while it's up in the sky, right? Different people are going to have different roles. A site owner needs to know different stuff than an end user versus an admin. And so how do we get training and reference content in front of people while we're going through these projects? So learning solutions is a generic thing, a generic concept. You may have some of your own, but also there are learning pathways in Viva Learning that are offerings from Microsoft that really help us. They give us a platform, and in the case of learning pathways, actually gives us content we can put in front of people to help them use the tools better.
Yep. Well said. I'm glad you said it. All right, Todd, you're up, man. What are we talking about with administration?
So I didn't want to be left out. And so part of the things that we can bolt onto the plane while it's flying are administrative things. We see waves of migrations, and not just the birds and all that, because spring's coming. But right now we're very much in a wave of migrations where we're seeing people move from file shares and things like that into SharePoint and M365, and there's just a lot up front. So I come in guns a-blazing, and I'm like, here's all the great admin things you can do, and people really get overwhelmed. But there's some things that you can add on as you're up and moving, and so some of them is just security things, like you can tighten it down as you're building it. Multi-factor authentication is one. You should always have that, no matter what. You should have it from day one. But if you don't have it from day one, it's easy enough to tack on at the end. Microsoft just keeps making that easier and easier. And part of that is conditional access. So there's a couple of different ways. Microsoft has been really good about giving you multiple ways to add multiple factor authentication. As they try to, Exchange had one and SharePoint had one. They're rolling that all into conditional access. So that's something you can do. But conditional access does MFA and a bunch of other things like, having different authentication experiences for people depending on where they're at, things like that. But those are things that you can tack on while you're building it up without breaking anything. And then another one, because we're seeing a lot of people move from file shares, their information architecture is just a mess because they used folders because they had to. That's all the file system had. And so that's another thing that you can do is you're building the plane and building out your intranet. Don't lose sight of the fact that you can fix some of those problems. And so moving data is one that I've got in here, and that's collapsing folders, adding metadata to the things, taking advantage of things like metadata, content types. And then scripting the creation of things. We talked about that a minute ago. Templatizing things. You can script things. I talked in the chat room. I said that I would happily spend 3 hours writing a script to cover a 10-second task. That is very little hyperbole there. But things like making lists and things like that, if you have the same list name and the same content type name, SharePoint and Microsoft 365 do a lot of magic behind the scenes to stitch those things together. And so if you want to make things consistent, scripting them, even if you could do it easily enough in the UI, that's another thing you can add. And you get that little maturity bump when you add those kind of things.
A really, really good point about scripting it simply because that means that the search engine, for instance, will look at it the same. Whereas even though you could do that in the UI, you can't get that reusability in the UI unless you do it in a very specific way. Right. So as long as you're thinking about it, great. But if you don't, you're kind of just doing it willy-nilly, you're not maybe going to leave yourself with as many powerful ways to then use that data later. So that is a really good point about scripting.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to move on to empowering content owners while building. And I think this is a Mark thing. So creating a site owners team.
Yeah, so one of the things we've found ourselves doing a lot, or every time we start working with a different team of site owners over the last few years, is we create a site owners team in Microsoft Teams. We usually name that something like, intranet site owners, so that it actually makes sense. So what we do is we're starting to form a community of those site owners. We're using the general channel for general conversation and sort of cross department or cross project or cross whatever the unit of measure is that we're building. And then one channel per those departments. So say we're building an intranet and each department's going to have an intranet site. Well, we have conversations about HR in the HR channel, but sometimes stuff happens in the HR channel and it's like, oh, that's interesting to everybody. So then we make sure that everybody knows about it in the general channel. So getting that community aspect of it where people are able to support each other, understanding all of the logistics on the same level, understanding the goals in the same way, being able to answer each other's questions. And in fact, as a consultant, one of my favorite things is to work myself out of a job, right? I want that community to be really strong so that I can go away at some point. The organization is still going to be very successful because they're supporting each other. And everything is happy and good. And then really that site owners team becomes the institutional memory container, if you will, for what happened when we did this thing, right? What happened when we built out that intranet? And, an intranet is never done, so that team should live forever-ish, so that community can continue to take advantage of things. You add new people to the community as they become site owners. You might take people out as they leave the organization. And it really becomes a powerful way to communicate during a project and then support each other afterwards.
I think it's also a spot where folks, especially content owners, especially if they're new to the platform, it's their training wheels to start, working with documents, working with the tools that they're going to be working with. And so it's a great spot for them to practice in a really safe space where they can ask, stupid questions. And just sort of get a good answer from either community members or from us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great point, Derek. I mean, if you're not using the tools that you're rolling out to everyone else well in advance, then you don't know what kinds of pain they're going to go through or kinds of questions they're going to have. So this is, like you said, it's a great sort of safe space for all that learning.
Yep, that's a great point as well. All right, so guidance on communication sites, maybe.
So typically when you're figuring out whether you call it guidance or governance, it's something that you're establishing that you also want to communicate out to the rest of the organization in addition to those site owners or content owners that you have. So very often you're ending up making a communication site as well about the intranet. So this can be your spot for all of that documented guidance and governance. It's also an option to be your destination for some of that Microsoft 365 training if you're using something like Learning Pathways to bring that information in. You can also use it for news. Of course, as you're headed towards whether you are doing a migration because you're updating or launching for the first time, you'll have news about the project before your go live, especially in that migration scenario. But then, of course, after the project ends, we all know Microsoft 365 is constantly changing, so it can serve as your long-term communication space as well for changes and updates, and as you advance that maturity, as you continue to build that plane while you're flying it.
All righty.
Another thing that you can do is very often for groups where this is a greenfield intranet, or maybe they're being introduced to Microsoft 365 for the first time, you can also build in the task management of the project as you're going through, again, as that safe learning space of, well, what tools are available? It could even be like a little beta test to decide which ones work well for our organization that we may want to launch. So looking at the next slide, some of the people in your project may not be familiar with all of the different integration points. So introducing this to them throughout the project is an opportunity for them to better understand what is at stake as well. Now, last but not least, you might also have an additional project site. So it might be, your business sponsor, your core team members, a bit separate from all of those different site owners where you're working on things like SharePoint lists. So maybe you have your site tracker there, all of your different planning. You can be co-authoring on documents as you're trying to get content into the intranet. And you may even be introducing them to external sharing for the first time, especially if they're working with an outside consultant. Now, this can again be another destination for Microsoft 365 training where we just focus it and target it more on the platform owner perspective. So it might be more administrative content than what we have on our guidance site, which is going to be more focused on those content owners and the different site visitors. And last but not least, again, we have another opportunity for news. Keep that out of email and keep it in a centralized place with all of our project documents. So any changes that are happening during the project can be announced right there in context.
Yeah, and I think we should bring up that we did do a Learning Pathways session, Ask and Praxis a long time ago, and that whole ability to bring the content to your users where they're working is something that you can really leverage. Like if you have a particular site that serves a particular business process, like writing a page or two of sort of like learning on how to use that thing, then linking right in the page that, hey, you're here, but you don't know what you're doing. Let me show you what you're doing and let me give you a rundown of what this site is all about. And that's a very powerful way to use that tool too. Okay, I wanted to quickly just say a couple of things about extending. I know we don't have a big dev community here, but just to know our keywords or know our processes, if we're doing customizations like the SharePoint framework or some other method of extending the Microsoft 365 platform, we want to remember that developer tenants are your friend and that we want to build our solutions in those dev tenants to get most of the kinks out first. And then we can use something called a site collection app catalog. There's a tenant app catalog that many people are probably familiar with. That's where the PNP search web parts would go, etc. But there's also an ability to create a site collection app catalog. And when you do that, you can deploy your SharePoint framework solution to that site collection app catalog, which then puts it in a boundary at that site collection so that code, that custom code that you have running in that app catalog is only can be used on that site collection. And it is a great way to do user acceptance testing or preview some new features of a solution that you have deployed in the tenant. So if you have something deployed in the tenant and you deploy a newer version in the site collection app catalog, when you're in that site collection, that version will take precedence. And so you'll be able to see the new features, test them out, check everything out before you deploy it into the tenant. So it's a great way to check things. And then of course, consider using a CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline to minimize some of the manual errors that can happen when you're building your custom solutions. Supporting citizen developers, what do we think about this?
So one thing to consider is that while you're building the plane while flying it, that you potentially have a whole other fleet of people who can also help you. You want to make sure that you're being thoughtful, of course, about that guidance and empowerment for them. I really appreciated what Mark Chrisman put in the chat earlier on when we were talking about documentation, where you shared that for citizen develop, any customization must be documented, which is standardized and templated. Documentation is regularly maintained. Custom thing must have a support model, and there should be business impact analysis updated annually. Those are really great recommendations of trying to set up some kind of governance and standard around, hey, if you make this business critical tool, then it would be, sorry, I got distracted by the chat. If you are building this business critical tool, then you want to make sure that you have a support system in place.
The chat is super distracting. I hate looking at the chat when we're talking. You know what? Another great use here of learning pathways, right? You could write everything like that Mark was proposing. That could be a little learning path in learning pathways that you're like, hey, you want to build a custom Power app or a Power Automate flow or whatever it might be. Here's our guidance. We're happy to let you do that, but you've got to, you know, go through this training and maybe sign off using a Microsoft form or something that you've gone through this process, and you're going to, you know, be responsible for this thing, and then empowering your users instead of being the department and no. So I think that's maybe a really powerful way to balance that. Don't just say no, like give them the guardrails that they need to build some cool stuff. So you never know what you might find. And thank you, Caleb, for distracting me in the chat.
I could tell exactly the moment you saw that too.
Yeah, I was like, damn it, Caleb. All right, so
you practice for later.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you. So here's our list of resources. And because of the power of sharing PowerPoint and Teams, these are all linkable. So if anybody wants to click on them, you can go ahead and do that. We've got the PMP Modern Search link, PMP PowerShell, a link to ShareGate, Work Made Simple, so a link for Orchestry, the Learning Pathways overview for Microsoft Learn, and I, last but not least, included creating your own dev tenant, a link to my blog, not Todd's, on how to create a dev tenant. And so with that, we are kind of right at the end of the hour. Half hour, excuse me. April 19th is when out of the box isn't enough, and it's definitely gonna be business focused. We're not alienating any of our regular visitors. We're gonna be business focused, but it's definitely gonna be a devs takeover session. We have Andrew Connell joining us. We have Stefan Bauer joining us. Derek is joining us, obviously, and myself. Todd, Mark, and Emily will be off to MVP Summit, so they won't be around for that one. So we're taking it over the train, and we're going to talk about where the edges are of the Microsoft 365 platform, where you can extend it, and what some of the scenarios are around when you would want to do that. It is conference season, so see us live at, here we go, the Microsoft Collaboration Conference. That's in Vegas. I will be there. Tech-O-Rama, that is in Belgium, and Todd will be there. The European Collaboration Summit, we are in force going to be there. That is Mark, Emily, Derek, myself, doing a bunch of stuff there. I was talking to Eric Schups yesterday, and he made the comment that buying a ticket to the European Collaboration Summit and a plane ticket to get there is actually cheaper than most tickets to US conferences. So I thought that was a really interesting thing to say. Really interesting. The Thrive conference, Emily and Mark, right? Do I have that right? And then 365 EduCon in DC. Again, Emily, Mark, Derek, myself, we're all going to be there. Cloud Dev Clarity is a joint podcast YouTube thingy that Andrew Connell and I do that are about cloud development. So join us on that if you are interested. And with that, I will wish you all a great afternoon, and we'll see you for our When Out of the Box Isn't Enough in a couple of weeks. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us this week on Ask and Praxis. We love getting your questions or session ideas. You can submit by using the link in About. If you find this helpful, hit that like or subscribe button and share this content with your colleagues. Join us again as we release new content every other Wednesday.